Thank you for joining me in this afternoon. We shall speak briefly, rather that the announcement was that the Philistines is a social phenomenon in the 12th century Mediterranean, and then I understood that I have only 1 hour to speak, now 15 minutes, so I decided I'm going to speak about the Southern Levant, and then maybe we'll have questions and we'll try to frame it in a broader Mediterranean context. I'm sorry that we'll have to speak about archaeological theory, but it's going to be short and painless. Creolization, hybridity, entanglement are key and buzzwords that have been proposed in the last couple of years, more or less successfully, depends in the context for the study of interregional interactions, including migration. I cannot do better than basically quote Michael Dietler, which rejects wholeheartedly the use of these keywords that basically were used as tools in other disciplines, then brought to archaeology, and did not help so much to promote or to further discussion about processes of migrations. So if archaeologists naively assume that every colonial situation can be reduced to a process of hybridity, then the term loses its explanatory content and ceases to explain anything. Basically, this is the dilemma of the box. If the box is big enough, then you can put everything in the universe into it. If the box is small enough, you can really have to take the social phenomena and take a big hammer and push it into the box. So hybridity, creolization, entanglement are really good, but they are rather large boxes that are not very helpful. I think we can speak about it further later. I was proposing, just as a method to escape some of this impasse, to look at interactions or to look at migration, trades, raids, invasion as not belonging to distinct social phenomena, but as belonging to a single sphere, okay, three-dimensional, even four-dimensional of interregional interaction. So, for example, you can have in migration, you can have the Mayflower, you can have Jamestown. In trade, you can have the Uluburun ship and you can have the Vix crater, but somewhere in between them, you have the Karum Kanish phenomenon, the old Assyrian colonies. Okay? And between raids and conquest and migration, you can have the foundation of Roman Corinth immediately after this destruction by the Romans. So these are actually phenomena that are interrelated, and you cannot deal with migration without dealing with trade. You cannot deal with trade without dealing with migration, etc. This is, and I'll put it explicitly, this is my theoretical premises for this coming lecture. Welcome. Now, imagine that you're in the best bakery that you've seen, and in this bakery you have all the types of cakes in the world, okay? And you need to describe them. So one way to describe them will be according to categories. Black Forest, Apfelstrudel, chocolate cake, okay? The best typology will have the same number of categories as the number of types of cakes. Of course, it will be meaningless, okay? Because it's going to be like a map of one-to-one of the world. On the other hand, if you begin to have categories like cakes that have apples inside, then you'll have problems in pushing the right cakes into the right pigeonholes. So that's a problem with categorization, and this is also the big problem in dealing with the intercultural interaction. There have been many attempts to deal with this problem, including typology of Minoan colonization by Brannigan and others. In my book, and I'll speak about it for 2 seconds for those who did not read it, and to save boredom from you also, that instead of dealing with categories, I'm dealing with variables. Instead of dealing with the types of cakes, I'm dealing with the recipe of how to make a cake. Because Many cakes have sugar in them, many cakes have flour in them, many cakes have some form of other oil or butter inside them. So if you take the parameters, in this case the ingredients, in this case the menu, how to make the recipe, how to make a cake, then you can actually characterize an interregional interaction. And some of them I present here, the number of people involved in the interaction. This is also for trade. This is also for invasion. This is for all form of interregional interaction. The duration of the interaction, which is critical for knowing if this is trade or migration. The cultural distance between the cultures, the segment of population involved, men, women, families, elite groups, professions, and the balance of power between the cultures involved in the interaction, which will have a very strong influence on the outcome of this interaction. And 6, I think I put it because I felt like PC this morning, the level of pluralism and tolerance within the interacting society. Of course, this thing was not on the top interest of people in the 13th and 12th century BC. Of course, this is but a sample of how this thing should look, and I'm working on better variables, but I think this may show you another way of how to deal with describing cultural interactions. One criterion that I use is a criterion of deep change in the archaeological identification of migration. That is, deep change is when material culture assemblage is changing fast throughout the different types of material culture, and the one that is more or less permanent. What I would like to speak with you for the rest of this talk is, can we still speak about the old paradigms? And now I'm speaking about old paradigms of interactions at the end of the late Bronze Age, is the paradigms of conquest and settlement in the Pentapolis, the 5 cities of the Philistines at the southern coastal plain, that is Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron. Do we have maritime migration? Is this a commercial phenomenon? Because, of course, the antithesis to the paradigm of conquest and settlement is the commercial phenomenon advocated by Susan Sherratt. And, most importantly, what is the nature of interaction with local population? Do we have a situation, as Peter van Dommelen defined, of asymmetrical power relations that are typical of the colonial situation? Let's begin by going from one side to the other and see how the transition between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age occurred. And in Ashkelon, phase 21, we have an Egyptian fortress which is abandoned. There are shifting sands on top of it before the arrival, or so-called the arrival of the Philistines. The date of this fortress is sometimes between Merneptah and Ramses III. That is, latest 13th century, earliest 12th century. But we are sure, and we know it because of the type of pottery, because of the type of Egyptian beer jugs. However, just on top of this abandoned Egyptian-style complex, without a destruction level, you have phases 20 and 19, which are humble dwellings, no fortification, and the first appearance of locally made Aegean-style vessels. And we'll go over it later. But the most important bit is that we do not have here a destruction separates between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. When we speak about Ashdod, the site is unfortified at the late Bronze Age, and then at the very beginning of the Iron Age, it seems that the Canaanite, Egyptianized governor residency is going through some changes without a major destruction. They're just reusing the place, but they're using it in a different manner. they're building this Aegean-style hearths, and Aegean-style pottery begins to appear without any destruction. Although you'll find in literature evidence of destruction, or rather claims for destruction, this destruction level was actually never found and never portrayed. But the paradigm of violent conquest was so strong that it's actually appeared in the literature. In Tel Mikne Ekron, inland, basically there is a destruction of this tiny Canaanite village in the northeastern necropolis of Stratum 9, Field 1. However, on top of it, there's another Canaanite village. So between two Canaanite villages, there is a destruction. And then on top of them, in Stratum 7, begins the first appearance of Aegean material culture all around the Tel. Much, much larger site, something like 20 hectares. Finally, Tel Asafi Gat. There are late Bronze Age levels. There are 11th century levels. But to date, there's no fully excavated 12th century level. So we do not know, because on the top of the Tel, there is a Crusader fort, we do not know yet, or rather, Aaron Meir, the excavator, does not know yet what is the nature of transition between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. To sum up, it is possible to raise significant challenges to the paradigm of violent conquest by the sea people and immediate settlement on the still smoking remains of the Canaanite settlement. Rather, if we look closely at the material culture remains, perhaps a new narrative should emerge. And now the question of how deep is the change? And here we should present numbers, because the change in material culture is not only of change in the quality of material culture, but also in quantity. Unfortunately, there's no available statistic to all excavations, because some excavations were carried out in the 60s, and thus they did not count all the pottery, or even not all the rims of the vessels. We have from Ashdod area H, Stratum 13, the first one of the 12th century. 73% is Canaanite, 18% is Mycenaean 3C and Aegean, and 6% is Philistine bichrome. Basically, it's something like 24% Aegean style. Of course, there's much residual material. These are long-standing tells. So there's going to be a lot of residual pottery from late Bronze Age remains. It is still going around in the levels of the early Iron Age. Tel Mikne Ekron, Field 4, Stratum 7, the earliest one, 52% Mycenaean 3C1B and coarse work cooking jugs, and 48 Canaanite tradition pottery. Of course, we can, have a huge fight on what is every type, is it Aegean or not, but it will just give you amount of the scale. A project I'm currently involved with is the publication of Phase 20 in Ashkelon, Grid 38. Something like 14 to 16% Aegean style in floor deposits and 24 to 26 Aegean style in open areas, probably meaning that these people really swept the floors nicely and pushing all the nice pottery, the broken ice pottery, to the outside. But this gives you some idea that the appearance of Aegean pottery, or Aegean locally made pottery, was not incidental, but rather came as a major part of the pottery assemblage. Let's now talk about variety. I would not dwell on which Furomark form and which Furomark shape is this, and how is it called, etc. But you can see that there's a variety of open forms, both the schiphoi and the shallow angular balls of several different types, some strange basins, very, very few Kylicus, which is I think it has a meaning that's so few Kylicus, and a wide array of creators. Good number of them are pictorial from Ekron and Ashdod. Hopefully, in the next couple of years, you see also the assemblage from Ashkelon, which has also similar forms. Closed forms, you have an abundance of jugs that are not Canaanite. Of course, the stirrup jars, feeding bottles, strainer jugs, etc. There are also rarer forms like large hydrias that are rarer. This is just to show you that there's almost a complete assemblage of Aegean pottery, not only the open serving vessels, but also closed serving vessels. An important missing pieces are large stirrup jars, large commercial stirrup jars that are missing. This may have also some form of significance. When we're talking about deep change, we're talking about change in behavioral patterns. Change in behavioral patterns begins at the very basic activities in every house. Cooking in each of the houses in Philistia is conducted by Aegean-style cooking jugs. And these are made from local clays, but using different clay recipes than the local Canaanite jugs. They contain much more sand, meaning that those who made them knew what they wanted to achieve in the fabric, possibly ones that are fit for slow cooking. And they come together with Aegean-style hearths. I'm calling them Aegean-style. Of course, they can be also Western Anatolian or Cypriot, which I don't believe, but they may also be. And there are arrays of these hearths, mostly rectangular, sometimes keyhole, sometimes round. And it's amazing that before that, none of the Canaanites had thought for the entire Middle and Late Bronze Age to put some kind of hearth inside their houses. I mean, they were living in winters too, but no, they did not do it. Also, the form of cooking, by the way, that was found just outside the modified governor residence at Ashdod, and this guy was found by it. And look at the burn marks on the sides. All of them have burn marks on their sides. This is for those of you who are pottery typology buffs, and they would like to see that it has good parallels in both Greek mainland and in Crete and in numerous other places. This is a good Aegean form that is stemming from forms of the late Helladic 3b and continuing into late Helladic 3c. I'll be delighted to answer more questions about variability within this form. But back to use patterns, you can see that Ashdod, Thebes, Chania, Chalasmenos, Mycenae, and numerous other sites, basically how they use it is they put it with the side to the fire. They put it on the edge of the hearth, and these are used for slow cooking or for stewing of some form of food that has much liquid inside it. And this is a totally different manner of cooking than the Canaanites are using. The Canaanites are using large open cooking pots. And another interesting thing, all of them have base. They were meant to be put on a straight surface. None of the Canaanite, and also, by the way, the Cypriot cooking pots of the late Cypriot 2c have a base. Means they were intended to be put on straight surfaces for cooking. At the same time, there is a continuation of Canaanite cooking tradition in each and every Philistine site and in each and every Philistine house. And you can see a direct continuity in the forms of the open Canaanite cooking pot in Ashdod, but the same thing happens in Tel Mikne Ekron and in Ashkelon. The typology continues, and it is very similar to other Canaanite sites that are outside the sphere of the Philistines. Meaning, basically, that side by side with these newly arrived cooking traditions, the old cooking traditions still were maintained. But they were maintained at the same houses. How do we know it? Because the bread ovens, the taboons that typical of every Canaanite house starting from the Middle Bronze Age on, do continue to appear in the earliest Philistine levels at both Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Tel Mikne Ekron. In every single house, they are not connected with these cooking pots, but they are connected with Canaanite bread baking practices. And at the same time, there's a continuity in the production of local, and please excuse me for using the term Canaanite pottery that is using both ethnic and type of pottery, but I use it the same manner as people are using Mycenaean pottery. But basically there's a continuation of the assemblage of the Canaanite pottery from the 13th century into the 12th century without any interruption. Thus, for example, those who are interested in reading further about it, please read the article by Steger, Master, and myself about the pottery of Ashdod, the local pottery of, Ashkelon, that basically show that it's identical to the pottery of Lachish, that is further inland, but has no Aegean elements in it. And you have all types of pottery for all functions, starting from serving vessels to stands, to lamps, to goblets, and of course the Canaanite amphoras of various types. And I'm coming to the uncomfortable feeling that every house basically had, to a large degree, 2 complete ceramic assemblages. I know what you're thinking. We'll get to it in the next slide. But every house, and we'll need to explain it, every house had 2 distinct pottery assemblages. You can cook, you can eat, you can consume your food and drink in 2 different traditions at the same house, and this phenomena exists in every house excavated in Philistia. Okay, I lied, it's in 2 slides. There's also a new form of textile production. While in the late Bronze Age there was the vertical loom probably existing in Canaan, which did not use loom weights. Okay, it was a frame, and the frame had a beam, and the beam was weighted by this bagel-like stone object that you find them from time to time. Immediately at the very beginning of the Iron Age, you find these ugly, ugly things, and you don't find them 1 or 2, you find dozens of them. And they exist in 2 distinct, I think 2, it may be more, 2 distinct weight categories. I'm calling them Aegean ? Because I'm not sure if they come from the Aegean or they come from Anatolia. So far, I think the earliest appearance of them is from Troy during the earlier 13th century. They also exist in Chania in late Minoan 3b, but not before. Okay, we'll talk about it. You know what? If you tell me that these are Cretans, in the second edition of the book, I said I solved the problem, and thank you. Because this is a big problem, because this is a new way in which you deal with domestic textile production, because these appear almost in every house. And they appear by the dozens, and they have this distinct disposal patterns. What you do is you dig a small pit in the main room, and you discard them, and then you cover it. Many times it's connected with the hearth. By the way, there's also similar phenomena at Mount Paleocastro. So you dig a small hole, you deposit them. It's probably connected with things that are happening within the house and have to be discarded within the house. But also, who would think about making these things out of mud and using it for textile? It's something which is really, really simple technology, but it's really, really catching. Indeed, in Philistia, it catches, and until the 10th century, it's been used until they find something better. Where did it come from? It's a different question, but it appears, and it's very likely connected to other forms of migration. Also, the mechanism of transmission of these household activities is something which is extremely important, because somebody had to teach all the women, children, and men in Philistia how to cook and how to weave in this foreign style. So I would say it answers the criterion of a deep change. By the way, these are interesting because they come from a rural site called Kubur el-Walaida. It's south of Ashkelon. So at some point, it's also going outside the Pentapolis sites into the rural sites. A commercial phenomenon, as Sherrod used to say. The Philistines were actually, there was nothing like it. The Philistines, they were just people that were imitating late Helladic 3C provincial ware that were made in Cyprus and other places. When trade stopped, these people started to imitate trade. Therefore, you have this phenomena. However, in a study that Anna Lucia D'Agata, Hans Mommsens, and me have conducted a decade ago, we've actually located all the imported 3C from Canaan, and all of them come from sites north of the valley of Jezreel. None of them come from Philistia. So it seems that, and we sampled dozens of them, and they all come from Cyprus, besides like one or two. So it seems that trade was never a factor in igniting the local production of late Helladic 3C ware, which is amazing. It's also amazing why we couldn't find any Cypriot, and it's really easy to find Cypriot late Helladic 3C style pottery because it's whitish material or creamish material. It's beautiful. It's really easy to find. And of the tens of thousands of sherds that were analyzed from Ashkelon, and even more from the other sides of Philistia, they're simply not found. There are very, very few other imports. There's one storage yard, which is possibly Cilician, coming from Ashkelon. But it is so rare that it's even not worth speaking about as something that may ignite local production. Now, something about the Philistine as a hydrophobic phenomenon. How interesting is that when people that have Aegean material culture traits are settling in Cyprus, they choose to do it by the sea. When they settled in Chios, in Emborio, they do it in a fantastic promontory by the sea. When they do it in Crete, they're probably doing it by the sea, okay? Because it's a nice place. Look at Paleocastro Castri. I mean, all these sites are, a variation on the theme of Paleocastro Castri. When these people get to southern Canaan, immediately what they do first is get away from the sea. So all the sites, apart from Ashkelon, are non-coastal. And there are fantastic places to settle. Look at this place. I mean, if I was some Cretan person of the 12th century and I was looking at this beach, you have to erase some of the sands here. I mean, it's looking like something like Koukounariès on Paros or something like this. A promontory with two places that you can use it as a dual harbor. Fantastic place. No, they were not using it. Okay, and this is Yavni. I'm half the way between Ashdod and Jaffa. And there's also other sites. The site of Ashdod is inland. The harbor site of Ashdod, on the estuary of the Lachish River, was inhabited until the 13th century. And it's a fantastic place. No, of course, nobody will settle there in the 12th century. It's too risky. You can see the sea from there. So it's a big, big problem, and I don't know what to do with it. The Philistines in the south are not maritime phenomenon, okay? If they come by boats, the first thing they do is to make a huge bonfire by the coast, then run to the hills, okay? So this is a path in Mediterranean history that is not taken by these people. The connectivity as adaptive strategy of risk management. No, they feel insecure enough. They don't want to be by the sea. Only in the 11th century, or rather towards the late 11th century, they begin to reconnect to the sea with the renewal of trade with Cyprus. These are just, the iconic images of connectivity. All right, okay, that's what I promised you. So you have two assemblages in each house. Do we have hybrid forms? Because that is what, if the theory about hybridity is correct, or creolization, we should expect immediate mixture of sorts when it's not happening. Decoration of the first phase of the Iron Age is very Aegean. Immediately later, it's becoming even more Aegean. I mean, the percentage of Aegean pottery is rising after the first stage of Philistine settlement. And when you have hybrid forms, they're very, very rare. This, for example, is coming from 11th century Tel Mikne, and it shows an Aegean-style crater with the Canaanite palm tree. Another one of these here, also of 11th century, and this is late 11th century from Tel Kasila, also of that palm tree. So I would not say that there are forms of hybridity within the core of Philistia. But when you're going to the periphery, when you don't have good mechanisms for cultural transmission, you begin to have not hybridization, but innovative forms. Because the processes of cultural transmission do not work so well in the periphery. So, for example, in places like Megiddo, in places like Tel Kasila, in north of Philistia, what you have is hybrid forms, it should be called innovative forms, that combine the lower part of the Canaanite cooking pot with the upper part of the Aegean-style cooking pot, and you get this. And this, ladies and gentlemen, will be the canonical cooking pot of the Iron Age throughout Israel. Okay? And it was formed by this form of imperfect cultural transmission. Do you want to see another example in the most basic forms of material culture? These guys. Okay? These guys continue all the way to the late 11th century in all the Philistine sites. One of them exists in Megiddo, but in the periphery, what you have them is they're becoming more squat, and then some genius Canaanite said, let's make a hole inside them. It will be so much easier. So therefore, you have these hybrid forms in late 11th century. Tel Kasila, this was the most successful kid in the kindergarten, eh? And you can see that these are innovative forms. This is also 11th century at Megiddo. And then they decide why not to make them larger, and then you have the donut shape loom weight, which will be the typical Iron Age too. But these innovations are happening only in the periphery. They don't happen in the core, because in the core, the processes of cultural transmission within the Hellenistic sphere are strong. Just to quote a very good article of Jung, which shows this how hybrid forms are formed in the Syrian coast in Tel Kazel. He showed how you take a Mycenaean form and how you take local elements and you create this hybrid form. This may exist much more in the Syrian coast than it's happening in the southern Canaanite coast in Philistia. Now I have to tell you a narrative, because every reconstruction must have a narrative. And the narrative will also have to answer how transmission, how cultural transmission happened. Of course, you can change it with different narrative, but I would argue that it is essential to have a narrative rather than to have a vague term. Because if you have a vague term, you have still this box in which you can put the entire universe. If you have a narrative, you have to either improve your narrative, reject it, or suggest a new narrative. Therefore, I put my head on the block and suggest a narrative. And the narrative is saying that already in the process of settlement, you have intercultural families. And in an article that 15 years ago, Deborah Sweeney and I were writing about the women in the Medinat Habu reliefs, we have noticed that all of them have different hairdos. Actually, some of the women are Syro-Canaanite or Hittite men, but it does not matter. But the interesting bit is, and it's very likely that because it's a unique scene in Egyptian art, there is no other one that they can copy. There is no Ramses II relief that is showing Ramses II fighting these feathered head people. So it has to be some form of truth inside it, some form of depiction inside it. So if you see that these women have all different hairdos, I would argue that they reflect intercultural unions that are occurring throughout the routes of their migration by the time that they're reaching to Philistia. And when they go to found new settlements, such as in Ashkelon, on the ruined remains of the Egyptian fort, they don't do it alone. They do it with the local Canaanites that also need a place to do it, and with beneficial results for everybody. So I would not also argue that these people came in force trying to destroy everything in their wake. I don't think it would fly well with the local Canaanite population. But rather what happened was the formation of a multicultural society that existed more or less for 200 years, or at least multicultural behavioral patterns existing within every household in Philistia. Children are manifesting group identity. You can see it in the 25th of March in Greece, and you can see it in these young Philistine boys that already have the headdress of the adults. This is a really important trait because it's showing how this identity is moving from one generation to the other. I cannot stress enough the importance of socialization within the domestic sphere. I would not begin to quote here from Bourdieu about the formation of the habitus, but these rather evocative images of women and their children very busy in doing the most important thing, which is to observe other people doing things and to imitate by seeing, is, I think, what was happening in each one of these houses in Philistia. May I speak now about one or many events? We assume the sea people as a horde of people, probably riding a big arrow that is coming from one place in the Mediterranean to another place where the arrow ends. I would rather like to raise a possibility of several events that are happening more or less at the same time. That you have scouts, initial settlers, a group of men, families, and only later there's a beginning of production of material culture. So basically you will not see the very, very first group of settlers, or the phases of settlement. And if you have several groups of these coming for different sites or coming to the same site, how would you know who is there? And what I would like to argue very briefly, that if you're looking very, very carefully, you can see minute differentiation between the different sites in Philistia in aspects of material culture that may indicate more than one group. Variability in the late Helladic 3C style pottery exists between the sites. For example, in Ashdod and Tel Mikne Ekron, there's these typical birds. In Ashkelon, the typical birds appear only later. In Ashkelon, there's also a style that is geometric, which is very different than the earlier style of Ashdod and Tel Mikne Ekron. This may indicate that at least those who produced the pottery did not come from one tradition at the same time. Something extremely interesting, I was speaking with Reinhard Jung very recently, is the great variability in the typology of the Aegean-style cooking pot rims. This we have not published yet, but it's interesting. He said that in Enkomi, for example, you have one type of rim. That's it. In Philistia, you have several. You have straight rim, gutter rim, a rim with small, slight inclination, etc. This may indicate, not to mention also variability in the forms of the base, this may indicate that starting from the earliest phases, there is variability, and the variability should be meaningful. And we're talking about really the earliest, perhaps the earliest 10 years of settlement. Other differences may be regional or temporal. For example, where do you have rounded halves and where do you have rectangular? I tend to think that the rounded are later and the rectangular are earlier. All the rectangular are 12th century and early 11th, and then you begin to have, in places like Tel Mikne Ekron and in Gath, you begin to have these rounded pebble ones in the 11th century. Why is it coming in the 11th century? I may give you some ideas soon. The idea I wish to sell you about the 11th century is that something happens with Cyprus. And it's possible that the renewal of contacts with Cyprus is slightly earlier than thought, and thus Cypriot types of the proto-white painted are getting into the Philistine bichrome repertoire already, let's say, in the early 11th century. This bottle, this horn-shaped bottle, and I think also the hearth belongs to the same tradition. Another perhaps manifestation of this in the area of cult, the incised scapula of cows that is appearing also in the 11th century. Is this connected with migration or not? That's a really big question. Because not all the traits change on one hand. On the other hand, it's possible that if there was small migration, the migrants could do very well with the existing Aegean-style material culture and only introduce few of the new style. So I would separate between the events of the early 12th century and the events of the earliest 11th century. I think they belong to different phenomena, and they should be differentiated with all vigor. And I'm sure these things happen also in other places beside the southern coast of Israel, so we should be aware of this. And there's this thing. During the 12th century, there's no handmade burnished ware in all Philistia. There are arguments there's one vessel in Tel Mikne Ekron that is somewhat warped at the bottom, so it's connected with handmade burnished ware. No. Also in the 11th century, let's face it, there's not too much handmade burnished ware. I mean, there's these things in the shrine of Tel Kasile that we have published, and they are handmade and they are burnished. If they are handmade and burnished, are they handmade burnished ware? That's a big question. One of them, however, is not local. It's imported. But in any case, these things happen in the 11th century. And finally, in the 11th century, you have introduction of iron. And it's certain that these things come from Cyprus because, these guys are from Enkomi. This guy come from 11th century Tel Mikne. There's others from Tel Kasile. Of course, the origin was something that was made of bronze and probably from the Dodecanese, like the knives from Yalissos. Also, this sword pommel from gold. There's also one like it. It looks somewhat Italian to me, and I'm working on it now, but That's besides the point. So we have to make a very clear distinction between the 12th century and the 11th century interactions. To conclude, we need a theory for interaction. We need a theory that will include a descriptive vocabulary. We need to commit rather than to use catch-all phrases. I would suggest you can take it or leave it, use interaction parameters as a criteria and deep change as a criterion for migration. I would support the existence of multicultural society in Philistia. I would encourage to follow and check if this idea exists in the sites in the coast of Syria and in Cyprus. I would argue that there's no evidence for colonial asymmetry between migrants and local population. There's no evidence for conquest. There's no evidence for, say, discrimination of local Canaanite population. Rather, it seems that Canaanite pottery and Aegean-style pottery are made at the same kilns, by the same potters, consumed at the same houses, but from different recipes. And there's differentiation between sites. This may indicate different events of settlement or different origins of settlers. We have a big lacuna of our understanding of Western Anatolia and Southwestern Anatolia during the latest Bronze Age. I think that if we look at the origin for all this phenomenon, the origin cannot be in Cyprus, because Cyprus was also, people came from Cyprus. It's not similar enough, the pictorial pottery is not similar enough to Crete. It has some similarity to the Decanissos. So I would look for the origin of some of these people somewhere south of the Decanissos, but this is, of course, a speculation. We talked about Cypriot impact only in the 11th century. Before that, you don't have Cypriot impact. How do we know it? Because there is no Cypriot coursework in the earliest Aegean style or the earliest phases of settlement in Philistia. Which is funny, because before that, during the late Bronze Age, there's plenty of wheel-made Cypriot wares. Something to think about. I would argue, but this, of course, should be proved, that there are different patterns of interaction with the Aegean world in Israel, Cyprus, Lebanon, and Syria. In each place, the interaction was different. In each case, the interaction was a result of power relations between the newcomers and older population. In many cases, it was accompanied by other types of interactions, such as raids, and in many cases, especially the Phoenician coast, with trade with Cyprus. So we should look at it really close and not lump all these areas together. And what is most intriguing for me these days is not all material culture aspects are carried within the so-called same cultural package. That is, you can get handmade burnished ware all the way to, let's say, Rasi Ben Khani and perhaps more to the south, but you don't get them in Philistia. On the other hand, you can get these loom weights all around. So it's very likely there are different mechanisms of transmission that we still have to refine our understanding of them. Thank you very much.